Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora, and welcome to the Weekly Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey with co-host Peter Bale. Peter, how are you?
I'm all right, Bernard. Well, we were just talking before we came on. I've had my first swim of the year because I had that weird ear thing, and God, it was beautiful. And for once, the Safe Swim app showed that my beach and many others in Auckland were looking good. But you've been basically in the water like a little porpoise.
That's true.
For the whole day, is that right? Like a little,
I often do look.
A little orca?
I do look. I like to think of myself more as a shark these days, but no, definitely porpoise, orca, and yeah, we really enjoy the sea. But it turns out not everyone can swim in the sea these days. Extraordinary stories out of both Christchurch and Wellington with the failure of their water treatment plants, to the point where you can't even go onto the beaches on the south coast in Wellington, and it could be for months.
But we have talked about Wellington. I mean, that is just situation normal in Wellington. There's either shit running down the streets or it's running into the water.
Yeah. No, it's awful.
It is, I thought the mayor handled it quite well because it's obviously not his exact problem. But do we know what caused that particular issue?
They're still getting to the bottom of it, but they've been talking about replacing that for. They've been talking about replacing that for quite some time. And it's like a lot of other spending on infrastructure by councils. It's been delayed. It's been put off because they don't want to put up rates and they don't want to take on debt. And it's now come home to haunt them. Christchurch is a slightly different story in that they had a fire 5 years ago and have really struggled to fix it since then.
That. Yeah.
But also Christchurch's population has grown like topsy and things are under pressure generally. The only thing sort of saving Christchurch...
Are we allowed to say grown like topsy anymore, Bernard? I'm not sure that we are, but carry on.
Is that bad? What's so bad?
I just remember who Topsy was when she was on the ice blocks, but carry on. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, carry on. I think we'll go and do some research on that afterwards.
Oh, no, I've just crossed the line somehow.
No.
And I also... with lots of population growth in Christchurch, their systems have come under pressure. The only reason that they're not in real trouble is that they basically had to replace all of their pipes after the earthquakes, and the government gave them a lot of money to do it. It's the only case really where our government has invested properly and used its own balance sheet to deal with our infrastructure issues, and it's meant that Christchurch still has been one of the places with the fastest growing housing supply and halfway reasonable house prices. Although of course that means a whole bunch of people move to Christchurch for the cheaper houses and they become a bit more expensive. But it's a real problem. So water quality is going to be one of these big issues, I think, in the election campaign.
Well, funny enough, I was sitting behind a van on the street the other day, and I noticed it had a "Stop Three Waters" sign on the back, and I was just thinking, I know this isn't literally, well, it is actually a Three Waters issue too, but how things might have been different had we gone down that. Not that would necessarily have solved the Wellington problem, but the things that people were opposed to about Three Waters were essentially giving these resources to some sort of Maori supervision. But actually, we've got really serious issues with these things, and the costs are coming straight back onto the rest of us, right?
Yeah, and it's an issue that has been made worse by climate change, of course, because these extreme events have kept hammering away at the government. And there's some good discussion in the last week or so about how we've become really adept at being ad hoc responders, and we never actually invest ahead of time or prepare ahead of time, which actually would be cheaper. And so that's the real issue there. So this week we've got a good chat with Catherine Dyer on the climate, and in particular the insurance retreat story, which has gone on in leaps and bounds this week, with a bunch of towns being cast aside by AA Insurance.
Well,
And
no. I mean, okay, we can talk about it when we get there, but they're not being cast aside. They're just saying for us, as a company, the existing level of risk we have in these places is as much as we can sustain. It's a very sensible thing to do if you're an
oh,
insurance
absolutely.
company.
Commercially, you're
Yeah.
quite right, but it's just dawned on everyone
Oh
now, of
no,
course.
absolutely.
After,
But it's not them saying we are going to pull out of Westport. It's just we can't, as a company, afford to have. But anyway, we'll get to that when we get to
yeah, no,
the climate
it's a
story. Yeah.
cracker. Yeah. So there's that, and then we'll have Robert.
And we'll have dugongs,
Oh, dude,
one of
yes,
my absolute favorite creatures, dugongs, sea
yeah,
cows, good dugongs.
yeah.
Carry
Maybe
on.
I'm more of a dugong than an orca or a porpoise.
I don't think you've lost so much weight, Bernard. You're most certainly not a dugong. You
And
may occasionally behave like a dugong, but you're not a dugong.
no,
Yeah, I think you're
and
more of a. Yeah, I know. Yeah. What do we? Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
By the time we get there, I'm going to have determined a creature. I did
okay.
see an amazing picture yesterday of what is called a pygmy sperm whale, which was discovered in Kafia yesterday,
Oh,
and the time the way we went, you used the word Topsy, or the character Topsy, which is now setting off our audience to wonder who the hell Topsy was, because they Tip Top most certainly do not make Topsies anymore. But the use of the word pygmy to describe a teeny weeny little species of sperm whale is probably also an insult to small people from Africa, the northeast of Africa. Anyway, Bernard, yes, we're going to do international affairs with Robert Patman. We're going to do your exploration of this bonkers story about whether we might join Australia. And we're going to look with Robert about the issue of what is the discussion about New Zealand joining an American alliance about rare earths and critical minerals mean for diplomacy in the way we conduct diplomacy, right? And we're going to sort of merge that into the domestic section. Yes?
yeah, and then we're going to talk to David Farrar, the pollster and commentator who does the polls for the National Party, and came out with an op-ed in the Post this week saying that New Zealand should become the seventh state of Australia. And I agree with him,
They wouldn't have us. Jesus, we'll discuss that, but yeah.
which we shall have some fun talking about. So great. But firstly,
Yeah, we wanted to. I mean, as we've said before, we sometimes start with media, and I just want. There is a relevant aspect here. So the Washington Post today, my old colleague and sometime friend Sir William Lewis fired 30% of the staff of the entire business and 300 of their 800 journalists in one hit. So this is Jeff Bezos bought it, I think, for $230 million from the Graham family nearly 10 years ago now. And this looks to me like the final or near final capitulation to Jeff Bezos realizing that in the Trump era, he can't run an independent news organization with its motto, democracy dies in darkness, that he created with the famous editor Marty Barron. So it has in relevance to us. Anna Fifield, who you and I both know, who was the former editor of the Dominion Post, has lost her job as Asia editor of the Washington Post. But they've lost people they've closed the Sydney office, they've shut down most of their Beijing office, and they've fired people, if not the entire bureau, in Kiev, Israel, all over the place. This is a really, and their entire sports section, which I care about less in a sense, but, and their book section, which, as somebody pointed out, was rather ironic, given the way that Amazon created, its initial launch and revenue on books.
Yeah.
It's a really what worries me about it, and as you know, Bernard, I'm often open to sort of commercial options here. But the promise when Will Lewis joined as chief executive a few years ago, 3 years ago, I think, was that they would go in a bold new direction with Jeff Bezos's money and support, and they would become the Washington Post would become a serious alternative to the New York Times. And there was always this thing in the States of the Washington Post was so much closer to Washington as a locale. It had a metro section. The New York Times, thank God, has thrived. Its revenue was up, I think, 10% in their results the other day. They have more than survived about a 30% fall that other people have had in search engine traffic. But the Washington Post is not going anywhere, and so now it's slash and burn. What I suspect is going to happen, but so this is what also puzzled me about it, is that the editor of the Washington Post, or executive editor, who I also know was Will's editor on the Wall Street Journal for a short time, said, we're going to relaunch the product. But the trouble is, there's just all cutting at the moment. There's no indication of what it's actually going to be. And they're essentially saying we're going to double down on politics. And so that is an area of American politics, and that is going to that is an area that's already very well occupied by Politico and Axios, both of which essentially pulled away from the Washington Post. And on the sports issue, when you shut down your sports thing, think about Washington. I mean, people don't. There are major national sports teams in Washington. In fact, Don Graham, the former owner of the Washington Post, said today in response to this, the elimination of their sports coverage, I'm going to find this very difficult because that was the way I entered the newspaper. In a sense, there's multiple ways to enter a paper, and his was through sports. So the New York Times took an entirely different approach. They did, in fact, cut a huge amount out of their sports coverage from the New York Times, but by then they'd already acquired the Athletic, a full-on global sports organization, which showed true innovation. I just don't see that from the Washington Post at the moment, and it's a great pity. I suspect what's going to happen with international coverage is that Will Lewis, the chief executive of the Washington Post, is on the board of Associated Press. I would not be surprised if they announce very shortly some sort of special deal with the Associated Press to give them a flow of somewhat curated international news, because I don't see how you can cover Trump's Washington, the impact of the United States, without having really excellent international coverage. So I think this is a really sad day, but I don't think it is something that we can blame the journalists of the Washington Post for. And at a time when we've just had the launch of Melania, which is an entire grift, where Jeff Bezos has I think is it 38 million that has gone directly to Melania from this, and for an unwatchable piece of crap like that. It's kind of it's where the oligarchy really shows its face, which is incredibly sad. And I'm not saying, to be clear, that everything was perfect at the Washington Post. Everybody needs to modernize their product, but this is a sad day for anybody who gives a damn about excellent international coverage.
And remember, the Washington Post was the paper that unmasked Richard Nixon and led to his impeachment.
Yeah, that was,
back
I
in the
believe,
days when
that was even. I think Topsies could still be bought around the time of Richard Nixon. That is a bloody long time ago, But they have done excellent coverage since. They've done very, very good coverage, really good coverage of Ukraine. But there hasn't been, in a sense, a story quite like that. Although, actually, what you're doing, could be a nice segue into the absolutely brilliant story that the Financial Times has really led on, which is the Epstein-Mandelson story in the UK. And there's a kind of angle to this, Bernard. Have we had New Zealand ministers who have been discovered to have written to bankers to give them their strategy that it might be a good idea to bully Nicola Willis or the finance minister from it's just incredible. This is treachery, it's treason, and it couldn't happen to a nicer guy.
Yes, and it's sort of extraordinary how it's starting to get a roll on again. It's always amazing to me that there is no shame anymore. At least in Nixon's day, there was shame, but in Britain, this stuff still seems to resonate, and the idea of Mandelson just sitting there in the Lords doing his thing, and now it looks like they're going to try and pass a specific piece of legislation to strip him of his knighthood.
Well, not
Which,
his knighthood, his lordship. He's not a
lordship,
knight. Thank
sorry.
God
Yes,
for that.
yes.
He was never made a knight, but he has now been stripped of the Privy Council, so he is neither right nor honourable.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, but
So-
I hope. Have you seen the picture of him in his underpants, presumably talking to a masseuse at Jeffrey Epstein's house?
No,
Yeah,
I've
it's
seen way
pretty-
too many pictures.
It's pretty gruesome, and having spent a little bit of time with him from time to time, a very long time ago, possibly when Topsys and Richard Nixon were right. No, it was about 1988 to 1992.
Really?
I used to spend time with him, and even then he was an oleaginous, slimy ball of spin doctory.
That's good
Catherine.
to know. And let's hope his lawyers are too busy. I suspect they are. So
Well, I
that's
don't
good.
think you can. I think oleaginous is fair comment. Slimy is fair comment.
Certainly paints a picture.
Were I to suggest that he was dishonest, would not be good.
But
Because I
but I think
might have to have some evidence. But
Keir
I'm
Starmer
afraid
has called him a liar. So
Yeah,
he's lied to
but
him
actually,
several times.
just to be slightly serious about this, even though it's on the day before Waitangi Day, small prediction: this will bring down Keir Starmer sooner than you think.
Yeah, no, he's
Gone.
under enormous
Toast.
pressure.
We've talked about him being toast before.
I
The
think,
toast is burning.
Yep. Yes. Speaking of burning, Catherine, it has been quite a week in climate news here in Aotearoa around the insurance, but also things have been dropping out of trees all over the place. Can you talk a bit about what's going on with, it's hot here and wet here, but up north there's a whole bunch of other things going on. Can you talk about that?
In the Northern Hemisphere, you mean? Or there's been like at least 3 separate stories this week that are really quite, telling, that are to do with wildlife doing strange things. So one is that there have been dugongs washing up dead on Thailand beaches. There have been iguanas dropping out of trees in Florida and bats dropping out of trees in Australia. And to cut
that's
all of those, they're all kind of climate change.
Well, at least there aren't. Well, it's if we've got dugongs dropping out of trees, then we're all in trouble.
Definitely. So good idea not to mix those things up. But yeah, so the bats are dropping out of trees in Australia because they're overheated. The iguanas are dropping out of trees in Florida because they're too cold. And the dugongs are washing up on beaches because they're too hungry. They're starving to death. And so, there's a bunch of kind of climate change related, but also kind of biodiversity loss kind of related. The dugongs,
I mean,
in
dugongs
particular,
are weirdly, Catherine. I've reported on dugongs from time to time for various things. When Saddam Hussein set fire to all the oil fields in Kuwait, and they poured oil into the Gulf. The Gulf is incredibly shallow. Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf is incredibly shallow, weirdly. And one of the few large mammals that lives in there is a species or a version of dugongs, and they did not take lightly to the arrival of huge amounts of oil, which, as you know, are not terribly good and also ruined their habitat. But also we have manatees, which are the close relative of dugongs, if not just a renamed creature in the Caribbean and in Florida, who are also finding it a little tough lately. I mean, they've just got to wake up and get fast and adapt a bit more quickly, don't they, really?
Well, see, the ones that were in Thailand were actually adapting in that they had moved down the coasts of Southeast Asia in search of sea meadows, which is sea meadow grass, which is what they like to graze on. And so as that was getting a bit thin further north, they sort of moved down the coast, and now it's getting a bit thin there as well. So it's all that's really indicative of the the heat content in the oceans and just general issues in general for them. And it kind of also brings us to another story this week, which is about the High Seas Treaty. And this is something New Zealand played a big role in negotiating a few years ago, which I know that's something you've written about before as well, Peter. And so we helped to negotiate it, and it has been ratified by the minimum number of countries, which was 60 countries, by January this year. So the treaty became live on January 26. But interestingly, New Zealand hasn't ratified it yet.
Now, why do you think that is, Catherine? Because you mentioned this today, and as you said, I wrote about it 3 years ago, I think, for North and South, and I interviewed the amazing or remarkable New Zealand diplomat who had been critical in negotiating it, Victoria Hallam, who then was the Deputy Secretary of Multilateral and Legal Affairs. And it was one of those examples where New Zealand really led the negotiations, as we did in Antarctica and on the the oceans treaties. What's going on that we haven't embraced that? Is it to do with undersea mining or what?
Not specifically. I mean, it's interesting because our own the way we manage our own exclusive economic zone, so the oceans that we control. So there's been a lot of slippage in terms of the things that we do there. But the High Seas Treaty is about everything beyond that. So it's the high seas where no country has exclusive control. And so what is specifically slowing us down from ratifying at the moment is that the government has said that it needs to pass some new regulations in order to be able to meet our international responsibilities under the treaty. And this is more around things like whether we are able to enforce actions on the high seas. So
do you mean whether there's a pragmatic? But surely, if we were leading on this legislation and it was sort of driven by New Zealand diplomats, some of these, can we actually take it? Can we actually? I think that's a really good reminder. Thank you that it is the seas beyond our 200-mile zone, but that some of those things must have been sorted out through the negotiations. So, is this just procedural or is it political/ideological in the government?
It's a matter of when you sign up, when you negotiate treaties and you sign up to things, then once you ratify it, you have an international responsibility around certain things. And that often implies that you need to introduce local legislation to enable you to perform that role. Now, we've had a couple of years to do that. We haven't done it. So we are now in the position where
we don't know. So you're saying you don't know yet. We don't know yet whether it's ideological or not. So Bernard needs to fire off a message to Shane Jones up at Waitangi and find out what the hell's going on, don't we?
They're saying that they intend to pass that legislation and ratify the treaty. They just haven't done it yet, but it's in the process. But there are some tricky aspects to it that might be particularly tricky for this government. There's things around how you treat marine genetic materials and how you use them, and for our domestic legislation, we have to negotiate under Te Tiriti and with Māori about how whether their interests are being sufficiently looked after. So that's a tricky bit of it that they have to.
Yeah, just about to ask a provocative question about whether Maori rights reach more than 200 miles off the shore. But Bernard wanted to bring things closer to shore about the insurance discussion, don't you, Bernard?
Yeah, Catherine, it's been quite instructive this week to see the headlines around the withdrawal of new business from Westport, North Canterbury and Blenheim by AA Insurance. For firstly flood risk in Westport, but also quake risk in Canterbury and a combination in Blenheim, which Peter and I discussed at the top of the show that this is, of course, perfectly commercial decision. But it seems to have surprised a few people that actually the insurance industry do believe in climate change and are, dealing with the impacts immediately and are passing on the costs and or changing their level of service. It seems to have shocked a few people.
Yeah, we've talked a lot before about how the insurance industry calculates risk and how that's quite different to the way that governments and climate scientists and so on think about risks. So, insurance companies are worried about staying solvent, and so they're thinking a bit about worst case scenarios. And that means that in a lot of cases they're ahead of the rest of us in terms of thinking about what are some of the things that could happen, and how do we respond to that. There have been broad headlines over the last year or two from insurers saying, in particular the Allianz International, saying that at 3 degrees of warming, there's no insurance and there's no capitalism, basically. So they're really kind of saying that there are some significant structural issues around the way insurance is provided. Now, we're just at the very thin edge of that at the moment, where you're starting to see insurance companies saying we're not sure, not just that they're withdrawing insurance, but the premiums have skyrocketed and are likely to continue to do so. So this is not just about at what time did the insurance companies say we won't insure you anymore, but it's about a loss of accessibility. If you can't afford insurance, then
But just to be clear, and this is, I mean, Bernard and you will be able to answer this perfectly. This was one insurance company, AA. I assume it's another one of the Australian-owned ones. I assume it's the New Zealand AA is no longer owned by Automobile Association members. It was just them saying, as a corporation, their risks were. We don't know whether this is an entire industry kind of withdrawal, but it might be the first indication of that, right, Bernard?
We have research that says, that has expectations built in about when insurance companies will start to withdraw coverage, particularly around coastal regions of New Zealand. So we have some good research from the likes of Belinda Story and Illinois and so on those sort of issues. So that's not surprising that we might be starting to see some of that. And we've seen a lot of insurance being withdrawn in the US from different states around rising insurance costs. So we know that that's coming, but what the government has announced recently in terms of what it's planning to investigate is quite limited. They're really just looking at what are the key drivers of price in the market. And so they're planning to do a 6-month inquiry into this and into in particular whether insurance companies are more profitable in New Zealand than they are in Australia, for instance, and they're looking at some of those structural issues and looking at how much of that price increase is due to external factors like climate change and hazard risk estimation. So the problem with that is that even if there is an issue with lack of competition in Aotearoa for insurance companies, that is very likely to be quite a small portion of those massive increases in insurance costs. Insurance companies will be looking at their risk exposure in New Zealand. And for that kind of risk exposure, they're also looking at what kind of profit do we need to make to balance that. And what the government will have to be really careful about is, if they try to clamp down on insurance companies and say, oh, you can't, there's a competition issue and you can't charge as much as that, there is a risk that they push them into withdrawing from the market, because what the signals we're getting from insurance companies at the moment is, in some cases, the risks are too high for our taste, for our blood. We are wobbly about coverage, and we're certainly pushing the prices up. And if you say you can't push the price up that much, well, maybe they just say, well, see you later.
Well,
so
good
that's
thing
going to
I
be
was just looking at a place in Huia, which I noticed its front lawn was about 18 inches above the high water mark.
Yeah, I'd think carefully about about that.
Exactly.
A lot of people have been learning that lesson lately. So it's quite a narrow inquiry that the government's planning to do, and there's a whole lot of things that they're not looking at that some people certainly are suggesting they ought to be looking at. One is they're not looking overall at adaptation and resilience and hazard risk in New Zealand. And in fact, there was an article out today from New Zealand Association of Scientists that were criticising the overall investment in research and saying that that is increasing New Zealand's hazard risk over the long term. So that comes into this as well. There's not enough being done there. There's also there's if they were interested in making quick changes for consumers, there's other areas they could look at around things like, people don't always assess the market properly in terms of what insurance rates are available to them. So there's a lot of stuff that could be done there around information and communication to people buying insurance. And there's also some people doing a bit of work, like Jonathan Boston is one, around the idea of solidarity insurance and how we structure the market in the long run going forward. So should we be doing more higher levels of coverage across more things as around what we used to call it the Earthquake Commission, but now it's being broadened to hazard risk.
I love the Earthquake and War Damages Commission. Yeah.
But that is a
Like
form
Topsy.
of solidarity insurance where we all pay into it. Well, we pay into it when we buy as a levy when we buy insurance elsewhere. So there's work they could do on the structure of those levies and also how we look at in the long term at moving to more solidarity options.
Yes, so Catherine, another one of those cases of past underinvestment and unpreparedness coming home to roost in the same way that not having done the work to firstly reduce emissions, but also invest in preparedness and risk mitigation in various other ways. It's a classic case of short-term thinking, and then the long-term consequences arrive in the short term, and you start to wonder what's going on here. It's one to keep an eye on. Catherine, thank you very much for coming on to the show.
Thanks,
Thank
Catherine.
you.
Talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Yes.
Professor Patman, it's so good to see you. So I haven't seen you since Tuesday, I think it was, when I talked to you for a story I'm doing for the Listener, and then I noticed you were on the Otago Daily Times, and then I think I might have even seen you in the Post. You're the thinking woman's pin-up of international affairs.
I don't think so, but nice for you to say so.
Hey, we wanted to talk to you about one of the things this week that we'd be really interested to talk to you about. Although I think let's start on the one but I also want you to just think briefly and hopefully stick in a sentence or two about the end today of the START treaties, the end of any global things on nuclear, which I know is not exactly your patch, but it's kind of a thing just sort of to note its passing. Now, one of the things that we were going to talk about was this extraordinary invitation, if you like. Bede Corrie, the head of the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and his deputy going to Washington for a rather large meeting to discuss critical minerals and rare earths. What do you see as going on there, where you've got this consortium at least coming together, or as you would say, a group of like-minded countries, except they're all doing it at the command, essentially, of the United States to try and find some new alternative to China on these critical minerals?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure just because some countries are responding, that means they're enthusiastic about the idea. A lot of countries regard it as just good form to offer a diplomatic sort of response. How enthusiastic they are. I mean, let me give you an example of what I mean about a pro forma response in the world of international politics. Excuse me. New Zealand didn't, when it was approached.
It's probably another television show asking you to come on for at least half an hour. Yeah.
But where was I? Yes, New Zealand, when it was asked to join Mr. Trump's so-called board of peace, we sat on that for a week, and then Julie said no. You may be getting the equivalent of people flying to Washington, say, oh, that's an interesting idea, and then going home. The Europeans are still smarting about Mr. Trump's territorial ambitions with regard to Greenland and, of course, its rare earth minerals. So I'm not sure you can't have it both ways. You can't, as Washington has tried to do, pursue an America first approach, which verges on extortion, threaten Canada and another ally, Denmark, with territorial annexation or part of them, Greenland, the autonomous territory in Greenland, and then expect everybody, oh yes, that's a great idea, Washington. We will be happy to surrender our autonomy with regard to our future access to rare earths. Yes, of course, countries want diverse sources of supply, and that's why I think many countries will go to Washington to see what the Americans have in mind. That doesn't necessarily translate, though, into an outcome which the State Department says there's such a feeling of anti-Chinese sentiment that they expect this thing to come together. I'm not sure. It's been drawn to our attention that our free trade agreement with China actually has clauses in it which seem to prevent us from signing any sort of exclusionary rare earth deal with the United States.
Oh, I didn't know that. I haven't read that. Could you just elaborate on that? That's such an interesting aspect, which I hadn't seen. We might be at risk of breaking news.
I think Helen Clark drew attention to this on X, that there are because the free trade agreement with China was updated in 2022. And of course, that agreement is very important for us. But there is a clause, and I haven't got it in front of me, but along the lines is that both parties should not sign agreements with other parties which in any way negatively impact on their trade relationship. And any exclusive deal with Washington with concern to rare earths minerals would perhaps fall into that category. So the government has to tread quite carefully here, and that's probably what it's doing. Just because I say they're having discussions with Washington, that doesn't mean they're going to do anything.
What did you make, though, that it was, because I'm intrigued, and I want Bernard to come on this because he knows Christopher Luxon much better than I do. We had the Prime Minister on Monday saying that the story was the story, which I think it was Cook or Mance, I can't remember which one did it, Mance did it, Bernard, but it said it was a frothy bit of speculation. And then the head of MFAT was in Washington with his deputy at a kind of, it wasn't that well reported yet. I think there were 20 countries there, 18 countries there, Romania, Australia, New Zealand, all of, when it was essentially a sort of an American come and talk to us immediately about it, or become Greenland. Obviously, the or become Greenland was in brackets.
If Washington believes that it can threaten democratic allies, and at the same time simultaneously build an exclusive arrangement with all these countries, which concerns access to rare earth minerals, I think they're going in for a rude shock. Carney's message struck a deep chord. The New Zealand government will be taking a political risk, not only in its trade relations with China, but in its wider international interests, if it did anything that would minimize its ability to maneuver in the current troubled international situation. So I think the government needs to be domestically very careful, because I think when Carney made that speech, many people across the political divide said at last there's a middle power that's not caving in the face of Trump's bullying. And middle powers see the way now, I think, a blueprint that Carney's at least advertised, for them to come up with their own agreements concerning mineral earths, which may include countries from the global south where many of these minerals are located. How many countries from the global south are going to Washington? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, Bernard, what did you make? Because I found, like I say, the fact that Bede Corrie was there, the head of MFAT, and his deputy went. The fact that we didn't really know about this event, it wasn't very well reported until it started happening. A couple of reporters, and then the Prime Minister says, "Well, it's not that. You're getting it all wrong." This is surely a much bigger thing than the Prime Minister wanted us to really believe.
Yeah, the Prime Minister said it was a frothy story, clearly wasn't. His own former Deputy Prime Minister, David Seymour, said it was a serious thing, and I'm sure Winston Peters doesn't send as senior people as Bede Corrie to Washington unless there's something to watch, at least. Now, whether that means we sign up to something is another thing, and I'm sure we'd want to be aware of what's going on there, and at least send people who can keep an eye on things closely. But this at some point we are forced into a corner and have to make a choice. Now we'll try and delay that and keep our heads below as many parapets as we can for as long as we can, and hope that there's a blood clot somewhere that will do everyone's work for us. But it is, this is going to keep happening while Trump is doing his thing. And to be frank, well, the Chinese are doing their thing as well. I mean, China has at least restricted its own exports to other countries after scooping up control of a whole bunch of rare earths, special minerals that are used in technology, to the point where, 15 years ago, Japan was bullied into a corner when China refused to sell it materials needed for its car industry, and its car industry almost shut down. So, I think both sides, so to speak, America and China, are not exactly purist on this. And Mark Carney is absolutely right. We need to be careful about not trying to throw our eggs into anyone's basket. We should keep our eggs very well protected and away from
Jesus, as usual, you're stretching them. There's one aspect about this, because it's just the United States is not only trying to form this coalition of willing partners to discuss the mining and exploration for these resources, which could include things like phosphorus in the Chatham Rise. So undersea mining could include rare earths, which I didn't even know. Well, we actually weirdly, and I'd say this to the critics of the show last week, we have discussed raw earths, rare earths, as Trump called them, on this show for about 3 years, including using the Tom Lehrer Elements song, which is my favorite one, which I won't try and repeat. But we're on top of the story in a sense, but are we ready to dig it up in New Zealand? The United States is setting up kind of national rare earths repositories like they have with oil and other resources. This is quite a big deal potentially for New Zealand, isn't it? Especially when you have a New Zealand First member of the coalition that wants to mine baby mine.
Yeah, it is a big deal, but in a sense, it's a major challenge for the government because for the reasons that you've just gone through. But New Zealand's not powerless in this situation, to use Mark Carney's words. Probably the safest option is for New Zealand to actively discuss this with Australia and Canada and the Europeans about the best way forward, because it seems to me an option that avoided close alignment with the Trump administration, which doesn't share our interests or values, nor do we share the interests or values with China, although we have a free trade agreement with them. It's probably the safest option would be for New Zealand to pursue a third approach which avoided close alignment with either superpower when it comes to access to minerals. And neither could really object to that. After all, we'd only be exercising our sovereign rights and to get the best deal for this country. I'm not sure the best deal lies at the behest of either China or the United States when it comes to New Zealand's interests. And quite frankly, Mr. Trump has demonstrated with his appalling behavior towards Canada and Denmark that he doesn't care much for, countries which happen to share values like democracy.
Yes, Robert, thank you very much for staying on, because we now have David Farrar joining us. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm very good.
Good. Welcome into the
David,
Hoon.
we don't know each other. I'm Peter Bale. I'm Bernard's co-host. We've exchanged tweets from time to time.
G'day, Peter.
Good.
Great. And David, we wanted to welcome you onto the show to talk about a potential for New Zealand to join Australia as a state. You put together an op-ed in the Post this week, which caused quite a stir, I think, and got a lot of people talking. What was your thinking on New Zealand joining Australia?
Well, I'd sum it up by saying necessary more than desirable. And how I got to it was, like many, I was taken by Mark Carney's speech at Davos, where he said, this is a transition, is a rupture, and medium powers need to work together to survive basically in this world. And I kept thinking about, okay, this is the status quo has changed. We need to change. What does this mean for New Zealand? And where I got to was, well, actually, look, just saying we're nimble, we're friendly to everyone, we have the right values, I don't think it's going to cut it. I think it is going to be a bit brutalist, that you have to be strong enough economically and military for people not just to squash you. And that when you look at the combined Australia and New Zealand stats, that we'd have the 11th biggest economy, military half the size of the UK, that's where I got to. And my experience, I guess, is, look, I spent 3 years involved on the sides with the TPP negotiations, Trans-Pacific Partnership, around the intellectual property chapter, because as Internet New Zealand, we were not wanting to just adopt US copyright law. And it occurred to me, look, today, there wouldn't be 3 years of negotiations. The US will just say, you can't have a 50-year copyright term. That's unfair for Hollywood. You're going to change your term to 100 years, or we're going to give you a 200% tariff on dairy. And we will just be, well, we can't afford 50,000 people to lose their jobs, so we're going to go along. So that's basically my thesis, is that in a fairly brutalist, might is right world, we would be better to be part of a larger country than relying on what's worked really well for us in the past, the friendly, independent, democratic, liberal New Zealand, because it's not just that the rules-based order has broken, but the values have broken too. It used to be when you do deals, you look for a win-win. We want you to feel good, we want us to feel good. But now it's like, I don't want to personalize this about Donald Trump, but, he gets out of bed, hasn't had his coffee. He doesn't like the fact you sent one troop member to Greenland, and he's announced 100% tariff on you.
David, Robert said to me today that he reminded me there was a book of quite some years ago about exactly this question of whether we should join. Of course, it was also conceived really at the point of federation in Australia and as the beginnings of our colonies, that we might be part of Australia. Robert, what's your sort of Thursday night dying to get out for a drink perspective on this idea?
Well, I think it's great that David's raised it. I drew a slightly different interpretation of Carney's speech. When he used the term rupture, he wasn't referring to the international rules-based order per se. I mean, that's very much in evidence. There's lots of, the rules-based order enables us to go about business, and it's very much a reality. Much of the rules are not widely known, but they facilitate commerce and international travel. I don't think he was referring to that. I think he was referring to the end of the US rules-based order. I think what he was trying to say was that you can't, let's be quite clear. For the last year, most liberal democracies, including our own government, has bitten their tongue and adopted a sort of softly approach in the hope they could coax Mr. Trump towards a more moderate approach, a more reasonable stance. And I think what Carney was saying, the game's up. This administration has written it down. They want to run the world through great powers. You only have to look at the national security strategy of December 2025, and they spell it out. They don't have any time for multilateral institutions unless they are fully in sync with America First interests. So I think what Carney was saying is what middle powers and small powers have to get organized. And he was saying they're not powerless. So I suppose what I would say, of course, New Zealand and Australia share a lot, but there are, I think in the current environment, it's not necessarily forcing New Zealand to pool its sovereignty with Australia, but it is saying to countries like New Zealand, the current environment, you're going to have to move out of your comfort zone. You can't rely on great powers to look after your interests because they're not going to. So it's incumbent for New Zealand to actually collaborate much more intensively with the likes of Australia and Canada, the Europeans and Scandinavians and countries of the global south to pursue their own interests, which is quite a new role for small and middle powers in the international order.
David, I wonder, though, whether we need to actually formally become a seventh state for these security reasons, given that, we have defend each other security agreements. If Australia was attacked, we would, of course, we'd help defend them. And we also have this incredibly integrated economy and labour market. Don't we just sort of get the protection of Australia anyway without having to join up with them?
Well, Australia will put their own interests first. We've seen this with the 501s. And interestingly, if we were part of Australia, they couldn't deport them to us anymore. You can't do internal deportations. And we've seen with their welfare changes too, they will put their own interest. Like, I'm not worried about the US or China invading us, but it's more that if they follow, actually, let's take China as an example, if they follow the Trump playbook and they say, if you send any ships through the South China Sea, we will put 100% tariff on your exports. We as New Zealand, we're not going to send a frigate through the South China Sea, are we? But would they say that to Australia?
We do regularly
Australia
send ships. Actually, just hang on a second, David. That's bollocks. We regularly send ships. We are part of the mission that constantly keeps the South China Sea and open. We're actually already part of that.
We have been doing it, but are we going to, if they realise that the Trump playbook, which is tariffs are now a form of economic coercion, and they start to, it's almost ironic that we're relying on China to act nicer and be more liberal and democratic almost than we are the United States. And I don't think that will happen. I think, again, let's not just make this about Trump. In Europe, 9 out of the 12 largest countries have nationalist governments or are leading in the polls. And I think, the world is going to be such a different place that actually the strength of being a big enough economy, it's not just the military, where people trying to push you around, it will actually hurt them more. Hurting us at the moment, US can do what it likes with us with tariffs, and they won't feel any economic pain from it. But when you're the 11th largest economy in the world, I think that's a different matter.
Yeah. The other thing, David, you mentioned in your column was that in a purely, practical economic sense, it's actually quite possible. Of course, Australia has a federal system. The states have their own parliaments. They have their own premiers. They have their own laws and, their own infrastructure budgets and their own control of their own health systems and their own education systems, which would mean we could continue on with that. But of course, there's some slightly higher tax rates and different arrangements with superannuation and various other things.
Only higher tax rates for the uber wealthy. 99% of New Zealanders would end up actually paying less tax under Australian federal tax rules.
Yeah, I actually think and would argue, along with you, that we should join Australia as the seventh state, as much for the security aspects, but also from a purely economic and intergenerational welfare point of view. There's a reason a whole bunch of New Zealanders are going to Australia, because it's actually, it's easy. The Australians have made it easier. And you get much better incomes, work protection. The unions are stronger. The wages are higher. You get the super. If you've got a disability or something, you get that amazingly big disability scheme. Why not do it for a whole bunch of reasons, not just security?
Look, I think there are economic reasons to do it too. I don't think if we had the old world order, the economic reasons would outweigh the loss of sovereignty, deciding our own future. But when you do put the new world order in the mix, as you say, I do think it would lead to probably higher wages in New Zealand. It's not that we would pay the same as Sydney, because Tasmania pays less than New South Wales. Sorry, my cat doesn't really understand
No,
boundaries.
I couldn't tell whether it was a cat or a raccoon or a sea snake,
no.
but
Yeah, I'll just move here. I haven't fed her
Yeah.
yet. That's why.
That's going viral, David.
Yes, I know. She loves the limelight. And so you would, I think, have high wages, at least at Tasmania's level, because when it would be so easy, it's one thing to move to another country to take a job up, but when you're part of the same country, people will go to where wages are higher. And there'd be an interesting aspect too, Bernard, and this would be tricky, but with the Treaty of Waitangi, my view is if we became a state of Australia, the treaty would still apply between the state government of New Zealand and iwi, and in areas we still control like healthcare, etc., and all that, you'd have that as part of the mix. But it would probably lessen some of the heat around the treaty, because some people fear that the treaty will mean a loss of democracy, etc., and all that. And when it's actually a subset of things it can affect, I actually think it would take some of the heat out. And you even could get a bit of an arbitrage effect where if people feel, look, trying to get resource for a solar farm is too difficult with New Zealand because you need iwi permission, and I'm going to go do it in Tasmania instead, well, that actually also will provide a bit of a market incentive for iwi to be reasonable about their conditions. So, not the major reason for it, but actually I do think it would take some of the heat out of the treaty issues.
Robert, do you think this is something that could actually happen? I mean, there's a whole bunch of countries that joined the European Union.
I think what David's done is hopefully initiated a bit of a debate on this subject. I think that's quite healthy. And I think you could make the case, as Bernard just has, that there's quite strong economic reasons. I suppose at this point in time, I would say my position, I think it's premature. I'm not sure there's tremendous domestic support for it at the moment. And I think for it to be successful, that it will have to be supported by a lot of people in this country and in Australia. So it's got to develop organically, really. I mean, it's a great idea if a debate leads to it. And if that debate leads to that organic support, then we may see it as a runner. I have two concerns at the moment. Firstly, I think I have a slightly different view from David about great powers at the moment. Yes, Trump can do things, but in a sense, great powers have less autonomy in the 21st century than they have in previous centuries, mainly because many of the problems we're faced with can't be fixed by great powers. Transnational terrorism, climate change, pandemics, none of these problems respect borders, nor does economic contagion. So I'm thinking thinking on Carney's speech, there is much more wiggle room for small powers. The question is psychological. Are small and middle powers going to actually assert themselves in a way they're not used to? If you think about it, the 21st century has been characterized not so much by great powers trying their weight around, and we've seen a bit of that recently, of course. That has been part of it. But we've also seen a tremendous void in global leadership on key issues which affect all states. So I suppose my two concerns are that we might be underestimating our agency in taking this step. And the other thing is it could be a big source of division in New Zealand at a time when we have plenty of foreign policy challenges and domestic challenges where we need to unite people rather than divide them.
Let me step in on that if you don't mind, and I do apologise that I've slipped in and slipped out, as it were. David, did I just hear you talk about the Treaty of Waitangi becoming some sort of state-based little thing that we would negotiate in our own little way? I mean, I think I've seen what's actually going on here with you. Is that's the true agenda here, isn't it? Because you're not terribly keen on the way the Treaty of Waitangi has been incorporated into New Zealand jurisprudence and so on in the last 50 years. Is that right?
Oh, I think it's gone too far. Absolutely. I'm not alone there. I don't think that it is a minor aspect of it for me, but it's one which I think is an interesting aspect that.
Yeah, but it's a minor aspect of joining Australia, but your particular objection to the Treaty of Waitangi is not a minor reason that you keep bringing it up, is it? It's a big issue for you.
My objection
It's
to
a big issue for
treaty
you, isn't it,
is
David?
that people, if I can answer, people see it as a constitutional document, as a
Yep.
supreme law, and it can't be that.
No.
Constitutional
No,
documents-
they don't see it as a supreme law, David. They
Well,
see
actually,
it.
talking
No.
to bureaucrats
They
at
absolutely
Wellington,
do
they
not see it as a supreme law. They see it as part of 50 years of jurisprudence after nearly 200 years of incorporation, or, sorry, 150 years of it existing, 50 years of it actually being incorporated. And you and people like you have this little, you're constantly pushing against it. I think you talk about activist judges, don't you?
Oh, I probably have talked about that, yes, and I'm very happy to debate that. I think, though, we're getting a bit removed from the...
No, I don't think we are, actually, David.
I don't think.
Well,
think.
right,
I have one other
let's
thing
have
to
a
say to you
debate.
before you
Let's
go,
have a
when we finish
treaty
this
debate.
particular subject. But I don't think we're getting away from it at all, because I think we're identifying where you're actually coming from.
No, look,
which
don't
is
you,
that-
Look, no, Peter, shut up. You do not say what my
Sorry.
motivations are. That is not fair.
I read your blog. I know exactly where you're coming from.
Guys,
No,
guys,
I'm not taking that, Peter. That is disrespectful.
Good faith is not where you're
Peter,
living.
Peter,
You do not get to say what my motivation is.
Okay, I have another one to ask you about. But carry on.
Of course.
guys, I actually don't think that David was using the seventh state thing as a way to somehow bring in the treaty things, and I don't think
Thank you.
that it's fair to ask it in that way. I mean, it's certainly an issue to talk about, which David raised, and I actually don't think that the Treaty of Waitangi would have any less importance in our constitutional arrangements if we were to become a state of Australia.
But would we? But okay, Bernard, would we then adopt similar approaches to our Indigenous population that Australia has adopted to
No,
its
absolutely not.
which can't
I'm
even have a
extremely
compact?
proud of our approach compared to Australia's approach.
Yeah,
Let there be no mistake.
and-
I
and-
think what we did with the treaty was a signally good, enlightened thing for New Zealand. I think the treaty settlements, historical, that have been underway are absolutely the right thing to do. But I think reasonable people can also disagree whether the treaty requires you to have a Maori health authority or a Maori equity unit within the Ministry of Health, and that you shouldn't call it genocide if you go for one. instead of the other.
Let's not mention the G word, David, because
Peter,
that will take us down a
I
very
don't want
dark
us-
path.
Peter, I do not want us to go to this other topic, please. The specific questions I wanted to ask David about was the
Do go
seventh
ahead,
state
Bernard.
op-ed. So I'm quite keen to just finally end this discussion by thanking David for coming onto the show, because we're up at our 6 o'clock mark, and to thank Robert for also coming onto the show. I think this is an interesting discussion. And I'm glad, David, that you came on to talk about it. It's obviously caused quite an interesting debate in various other media as well. And as I said in the show, this is an opportunity for me too to say, I actually think from an economic point of view, it'll be a good one. So I'd like to thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
you.
Bernard. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And we will finish the show there. Thank you very much, Robert. Great to see
You're
you.
very welcome. Cheers.
Cheers. And goodbye, everyone. We'll see you all back next